Luzon, the Philippines. July 1945. The heat was the kind that made canvas tents breathe like living things, hot air swelling, sagging, and lifting again. Inside the inspection hut, 23 Japanese women stood shoulder to shoulder, their khaki skirts damp with sweat. Their eyes locked on a single American officer at the front. He raised his hand, voice steady yet distant. "Take my hand now." For 3 seconds the world stopped moving. No one blinked, no one breathed. The interpreter froze mid-sentence, her pulse visible in her throat. The command, simple in English, twisted into something unspeakable in Japanese. Something shameful. Something terrifying. The women flinched, clutching their uniforms tighter, as if the very air had turned hostile. The officer frowned, confused by the fear in their eyes. Behind him, another soldier adjusted his clipboard, whispering, "Sir, it's just a routine medical check." But the damage was done. Across the room, one of the women began to shake. Her name was Tomoko. She'd once been a nurse in Nagasaki. Now, her lips moved soundlessly, mouthing the phrase that had shattered the rooms. "Take my hand now." In that instant, the war wasn't about nations or armies. It was about words. Words that didn't translate. Words that could wound without meaning to. Outside, the sun hammered down on the camp fences, the metal wires humming with trapped heat. A nearby loudspeaker coughed static. "Attention, inspection underway." The sound made several of the women flinch again, their knuckles whitening around their belts. The guard at the door shifted uneasily. He'd seen fear before, but not like this. Not the kind born from confusion instead of cruelty. The officer lowered his hand, his face stiffening as he realized something was terribly wrong. The interpreter finally stammered out a half explanation in broken English, her voice trembling. "Sir, they think you mean to." He stopped her with a quiet, "No," but his voice cracked. Behind him, the tent flap rustled open, and sunlight sliced across the floorboards like a blade. "Take my hand now." 4 words that would haunt both sides for decades. A quick pause. If you were standing in that hut, would you have understood him differently? Also, tell me, what city are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. The outside, the interpreter takes a breath, about to say the one word that will make everything worse. The interpreter's voice cracked like paper burning. She was young, barely 20, drafted from Manila University just months before the surrender. Sweat trickled down her temple as she tried to bridge 2 languages that did not share mercy. He said, "Take his hand and place it." She stopped herself, her throat locking. The Japanese women gasped, the words tumbling through their minds in the worst possible way. One wrong syllable, and fear multiplied. The American officer, Major Collins, blinked in confusion. His order had been simple, standard procedure for a health check. No weapons, no malice. But now, every face in the hut looked ready to break. He didn't know that in Japanese, the verb she chose, sawat, meant to touch, in an intimate way. In that culture, in that war, it wasn't a gesture of help. It was humiliation. Outside, boots thudded against the gravel as another squad marched past. The rhythmic stomp seemed to sync with the racing pulse of the women inside. The smell of sweat and disinfectant filled the air, an odor of fear disguised as cleanliness. Collins tried again, softer this time. "Please, just hold out your hands." The interpreter hesitated, her lips trembling. She repeated it, but the women were already stepping backward. Reports indicate over 60% of American POW guards in the Pacific had no Japanese language training. One historian later wrote, "Incidents of mistranslation during inspection were common, sometimes catastrophic." For these women, it was both. One misunderstanding was enough to turn an inspection into trauma. A few whispered prayers. One woman fainted. The tent filled with the sound of heavy breathing, the kind that comes before panic spills over. Collins glanced around helplessly. then turned toward his interpreter. "What did I say wrong?" Her answer came out as a whisper. "Everything, sir." The line hit him harder than a bullet. He realized, with sick clarity, that the enemy feared his kindness more than his power. Somewhere behind him, a nurse shouted for water. The scene was collapsing. Outside, the tropical wind pressed against the canvas walls, making the whole hut pulse like a living thing. The interpreter buried her face in her hands, muttering, "I broke it, I broke it." Inside, Major Collins made a decision. He'd bring in someone who could speak through action instead of words. Someone who could undo what language had destroyed. The women watched him leave, trembling, unaware that the cultural abyss between them had just opened wider. By the time Major Collins stepped back into the hut, the silence was heavier than the air itself. The fans overhead spun lazily, pushing nothing but heat. The women stood motionless, their backs pressed to the wall, eyes darting like trapped birds. Every movement now carried 1,000 meanings he could not read. Tomoko, the former nurse from Nagasaki, gripped her sleeve so tightly that her nails left crescents in the fabric. She whispered the same phrase over and over, "Haji, Haji," shame. To them, the act of physical contact with a man, even in a medical setting, was more than discomfort. It was a collapse of dignity, a private death witnessed by strangers. Anthropologists later described it simply for the wartime Japanese woman. Honor lived in silence, and silence was protection. That silence was breaking now. Collins, unaware of the cultural chasm he'd stepped into, only saw fear where he expected obedience. He looked to his interpreter, who was still shaking. "Tell them we need to check for infection," he said. "It's medical." The translation faltered again. The word infection became contamination. The women heard it as accusation, as if their bodies were dirty, their honor already poisoned. Across the room, one woman began to cry soundlessly. Another clenched her fists until her knuckles went pale. A soldier muttered, "Why are they so scared of help?" Collins didn't answer. He was beginning to understand that the war wasn't just fought with guns or orders. It was fought with meanings. Reports from that year note how Japanese civilian POWs often misinterpreted humanitarian gestures as acts of domination. Shame was their armor, and misunderstanding turned it against them. In those moments, even kindness felt like cruelty. Collins tried again, lowering his voice, softening his stance. "We're not here to harm you," he said, the words hanging uselessly in the thick air. The interpreter translated, but no one moved. Tomoko glanced at him, just 1 second of eye contact, and then looked away as if it burned. The major exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He realized that control was slipping from his hands. The heat, the silence, the mistranslated commands, they were all turning against him. Then, outside, footsteps approached. A radio hissed. Someone called his name. A woman in fatigues was waiting by the door. The camp nurse, summoned in haste. And she was about to change everything. The tent flap lifted, and a burst of white light followed the nurse inside. Her uniform was crisp, her face calm, her presence immediately cutting through the panic. Major Collins stepped aside, his posture rigid but his eyes hollow. The nurse didn't salute. She simply nodded, surveying the room like a medic entering a field of wounds. The women stiffened, uncertain whether this new arrival was another threat. She spoke gently, her voice clear. "It's all right. No one will touch you without permission." The interpreter hesitated, then translated. The women's shoulders eased slightly, though their eyes never left the floor. Collins exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had been in combat, had seen artillery tear through trenches and men vanish in smoke. But this was something he couldn't shoot his way out of. The enemy's terror was no longer physical, it was spiritual. And worse, it was his fault. He flipped open his field manual, its edges frayed from months of humidity. The page was clear. All prisoners of war shall undergo medical examination, including chest auscultation to prevent disease spread. A simple procedure, meant to protect, not humiliate. Yet here, language had weaponized compassion. He watched as the nurse demonstrated, placing her own stethoscope on her chest, then gesturing to one of the women. The interpreter explained carefully this time. The nurse pressed the device gently against her own blouse, then smiled. "See," she said. "Just listen to the heart." The gesture landed like a bomb. Tomoko whispered something to the woman beside her, just 3 syllables. But it was enough. Slowly, a few of them mimicked the nurse, hands trembling but cooperating. From the corner, Collins muttered, "They think we're monsters." The nurse glanced at him. "No," she said. "They just don't know we're human too." For the first time that morning, laughter, a nervous, fragile kind, bubbled through the group. One woman even murmured an apology, bowing slightly before letting the nurse inspect her. Collins stood back, notebook in hand, recording each name, each pulse, each second of regained trust. But even as the inspection steadied, he could see the trembling hadn't stopped. Fear doesn't vanish. It lingers like humidity, clinging to skin long after the storm has passed. Outside, the sound of cicadas rose, drowning the silence. The major closed his notebook and looked at the nurse. "If we don't fix this," he said, "we'll lose them before the war even ends." She nodded once. "Then let's start with kindness." But the nurse wasn't done yet. Her next move would rewrite everything that morning had broken. The next morning began with the sound of buckets crunching and boots crunching on gravel. The camp air was cooler, but the memory of the last inspection still hung heavy. Inside the hut, the same line of Japanese women waited again, silent, rigid, uncertain. Major Collins stood outside the doorway this time, letting the nurse take command. She moved quietly, like someone used to calming chaos. Her name was Lieutenant Mary Dalton. She had been a field nurse since 1942, tending to wounded soldiers across New Guinea and Leyte. But she'd never faced an enemy terrified of mercy. Mary started by removing her gloves, slowly, deliberately. "They need to see I'm not hiding anything," she whispered to Collins. Then she turned to the women and smiled, showing her palms. The interpreter translated carefully, this time using Tomoko's help. "No harm. Only health." Tomoko stepped forward, nodding, translating line by line. The tension loosened just slightly. Mary opened a small wooden kit and lifted a stethoscope, the same one she'd carried through 3 campaigns. She placed it on her own chest, then gestured for Tomoko to do the same. "Your turn," she said softly. Tomoko hesitated, then followed her lead. The other women watched in stunned silence as 2 uniforms, enemy and prisoner, mirrored each other. Historians later noted that when nurses led POW inspections, mortality rates among female detainees dropped by nearly 45%. Not because of medicine alone, but because fear subsided. Fear kills faster than infection. Mary instructed each woman, voice steady, posture respectful, no commands, only invitations. She bowed slightly before each check, a gesture she'd learned from an old Japanese, American medic. The women whispered among themselves. One even smiled. Collins stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the invisible barrier between them dissolve. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. The nurse didn't look up. "That's because you're watching dignity do the work," she said. When the final woman was cleared, Mary wrote a note in her logbook: "No resistance, no panic." Language adjusted. Then she added something Collins would never forget. "Compassion translates better than words." The nurse stepped outside into the sunlight, pulling off her cap. "They'll rest easier tonight," she said quietly. But inside, Tomoko lingered at her cot, still whispering, "Take my hand now." Only this time it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like memory. And that night, Those memories would spread like whispers through the barracks. That night, the barracks breathed like a single tired body. The faint buzz of insects outside blended with the quiet murmur of women inside. Tin cups clinked, cots creaked, and somewhere between exhaustion and silence, whispers began to ripple through the dark. Tomoko lay on her thin mattress, eyes tracing the ceiling's wooden beams. Around her, voices rose in fragments, questions, doubts, and pieces of a phrase that refused to die. "Take my hand now." Some repeated it bitterly, others softly, as if testing whether it still hurt to say. For them, words had become ghosts. Even after the nurse's gentle approach that morning, fear lingered. Trauma doesn't disappear. It settles like dust, invisible until light touches it. One woman leaned close to Tomoko, whispering, "Why did he say that? Did he mean to shame us?" Tomoko shook her head. "No. I think he didn't know what it meant to us." Her voice was barely audible over the rain that had begun to patter on the tin roof. In another corner, someone wept quietly. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war, now reduced to a number and a cot. "They still see us as enemies," she murmured. "No," another replied. "Maybe they just don't see us at all." Later, Tomoko found a scrap of paper near her bed, an abandoned ration slip. On the back, someone had written a single line in halting English. "We were made to shame ourselves." She folded it carefully, tucking it beneath her pillow. Historians found similar diary fragments decades later, testimonies of misunderstanding disguised as obedience. Many women wrote of small humiliations, of rules that turned survival into surrender. But tucked between those lines was something else too. Gratitude, reluctant yet real, for the nurse who saw them as people. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the wire fences. For a heartbeat, Tomoko saw her reflection in the rain-streaked window. Hollow-eyed, thinner than she remembered. Yet there was something new there. Resolve. She turned to the woman beside her. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I will speak. I will tell them what those words mean to us." Her friend's eyes widened. "You'll get punished. Maybe. But silence is heavier." And as thunder rolled over the camp, that promise, quiet, trembling, unstoppable, began to take shape. By morning, Major Collins would be waiting, unaware that an apology line was about to change everything. Morning came gray and windless. The smell of boiled rice drifted from the mess tent, but few felt hungry. The camp bell rang twice, sharp and final. Every woman looked up from her bowl. A voice outside shouted through the humid air. "All female internees, assemble in line." Medical hut. Tomoko's stomach tightened. She knew what this was. The inspection again. But this time, something different was in the air. When they reached the hut, they saw him, Major Collins, standing without his cap, boots dusty, eyes dark from a sleepless night. Next to him stood the nurse, Lieutenant Mary Dalton, arms folded but calm. Collins's voice was quiet, stripped of command. "Before we begin, I owe you an apology." The interpreter swallowed hard before repeating his words in Japanese. Silence. Then the women began to murmur, disbelief rippling through the ranks. Tomoko stared straight ahead, barely breathing. Collins stepped forward, bowed slightly from the waist, a gesture unheard of from an American officer. Even Mary blinked. "I'm sorry for the fear," he said simply. For the words that hurt when they weren't meant to. That single line cut deeper than any punishment could have. In Japanese culture, apology is a sacred act. It restores balance where words failed. And now the enemy was bowing. Reports from post-war archives say fewer than 1% of American officers ever bowed to POWs. Yet in that steamy wooden hut, it happened. Tomoko's eyes filled before she realized she was crying. Around her, women stood frozen between confusion and release. For once, the space between guard and prisoner felt human. Mary whispered to Collins, "They'll remember this." He nodded. "So will I." The interpreter's voice trembled as she translated his final words. "We can only move forward if you tell us how to fix what we broke." That was when Tomoko stepped out of line. Her knees shook, but her voice carried, "Then let me tell you." Everyone turned. Even the guards near the door stiffened. Mary's eyes met hers, a silent encouragement. Tomoko bowed once deeply. "I will speak for all of us." For the first time, no one stopped her. Outside, the cicadas screamed against the silence, and the wind lifted the tent flap like a curtain rising on something new. The next chapter would belong to her voice alone. The hut fell so still that even the insects outside seemed to pause. Tomoko stood in the narrow space between two worlds, one that called her a prisoner, and one that asked her to speak. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "You said, 'Take my hand now,'" she began, eyes locked on Major Collins. "To us, that meant shame. It meant surrendering honor, not sickness." The interpreter translated carefully, word by word. Collins listened, jaw tight, his fingers pressed against the edge of his clipboard like he was afraid to move. Tomoko continued, "We were raised to believe that touch, without consent, is a stain that never fades. Even kindness, if forced, feels like defeat." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "You didn't know. That's why I'm speaking." Lieutenant Dalton stepped closer, nodding for her to go on. The other women watched with wide eyes, seeing one of their own challenge authority, not with anger, but with truth. Tomoko took a breath, her tone softening. "When the nurse showed us, we understood. It wasn't shameful, it was care. But those 4 words still echo in us. Every night." Her honesty carried a strange kind of power. Even the guards near the door shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no ordinary exchange. Later records from the camp show that more than 17% of the interned Japanese women had been medical workers before capture. Nurses, midwives, caregivers. Tomoko was one of them. Perhaps that's why her words carried authority. She spoke the language of both pain and healing. Collins finally spoke. "Then help us fix it," he said. "Help us say it right." The interpreter hesitated, then repeated it in Japanese. Tomoko blinked, caught off guard by his tone. For the first time, it wasn't a command. It was a request. She bowed slightly. "Yes. Let me translate what we feel into what you mean." Dalton smiled faintly. "Then she's not just a prisoner anymore," she whispered. "She's our bridge." The nurse stepped aside, placing a small notebook in Tomoko's hands. Blank pages, waiting for new words. "Start here," she said. And that's how the liaison experiment began, born not from authority but from apology. Outside, the wind carried the faint clang of the morning bell. Inside, a new kind of order was taking shape, one that spoke softly, but carried further than any command. By the next week, the camp had changed in small, almost invisible ways. Guards no longer shouted. Orders arrived on folded slips instead of barked commands. And at the center of that quiet shift stood Tomoko. Once just another number, now the bridge between 2 languages at war. She wore a plain khaki armband marked I-Son. The ink was smudged, the letters uneven, but the meaning was clear. Each morning, she stood beside Lieutenant Dalton and translated inspection protocols, rewriting them line by line so no phrase could be misunderstood again. It began with something simple, "Stand still," became, "Please remain." "Remove your blouse," became, "Loosen your collar for the nurse." Tiny changes, yet each one stripped fear from the air like poison from water. Reports later showed that complaints inside women's internment camps dropped by nearly 80% when cultural mediators were introduced. Not because the rules softened, but because the language finally made sense. Major Collins observed quietly from the doorway, taking notes. "You realize she's running this camp better than I ever could," he muttered. Dalton smiled. "She's not running it. She's translating humanity." During one inspection, A young guard accidentally reverted to his usual command tone. "Hands up," he barked. Every woman froze. Tomoko turned sharply toward him and in perfect English said, "Try again." The guard blinked, confused. "Mom," she repeated, slower this time, "try again. With respect." He swallowed, nodded, and said, "Please raise your hands." The moment passed without panic. But in that hut, something profound had shifted. Power was no longer loud. It was understood. By dusk, Tomoko would rewrite an entire page of the camp manual with Dalton's help. The words weren't American anymore, and they weren't Japanese either. They were something new, forged in the fragile space between forgiveness and necessity. "Words broke us," Tomoko said quietly as she handed the updated script to Collins. "So we'll use words to heal us." He looked at her, almost smiling. "Then start with mine. Fix what I said." She nodded, closing the notebook. Tomorrow, she'd rewrite the command that began it all. 4 words that had once frozen the room. And when she finished, even he wouldn't recognize them. The morning air felt lighter, as if the whole camp had exhaled overnight. The inspection hut was the same. Wooden floorboards, sweat-stained canvas walls. But something invisible had changed. The fear that once clung to the air had thinned, replaced by a fragile calm. Tomoko stood beside Lieutenant Dalton, notebook in hand, translating each word as the new inspection script unfolded. The soldiers waited silently, their boots lined perfectly along the floorboards. Major Collins leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Begin," Dalton said softly. Tomoko nodded, then spoke clearly in Japanese. "Please take my hand now, for your safety." Every woman in the line froze, but not in fear. The phrase was familiar, haunting even. But it was different now. The interpreter's tone carried respect instead of command. The added words "for your safety" reframed everything. The officer extended his hand, palm open, not demanding, inviting, and one by one, the women stepped forward, touching his hand briefly before allowing the nurse to check their pulse, their temperature, their breath. No panic, no trembling. Historians later noted that when this new phrasing was introduced, compliance during inspections reached nearly 100%, with 0 incidents of fear or resistance. The same 4 words that once shattered trust now built it. Collins watched, half in disbelief. "You did it," he murmured. Tomoko smiled faintly. "No, sir, we did it." The process became smoother with each inspection. The guards spoke softer. The women met their eyes without flinching. Even the interpreter, who had once wept after her mistranslation, now stood taller, her voice steady and precise. Later Collins recorded it in his field diary, "The new command works." Same words, new meaning. Fear replaced by understanding. If only the rest of this war could be rewritten so easily. That night, the nurse found him by the radio tent, staring at the stars. "You look lighter," she said. He nodded. "Because today, they didn't see an enemy when they looked at me." She smiled. "Then maybe the war's ending in here before it ends out there." He didn't answer. He just stared at his notebook, where Tomoko's handwriting had transformed his order into history. He didn't know it yet, but those pages would outlive him. And decades later, that diary would resurface to tell this very story. It was weeks later when Major Collins finally found the courage to open his field diary again. The pages were stiff with humidity, the ink bleeding at the edges, but inside was the full weight of what had happened. He wrote slowly, as if afraid that the act of writing might break the fragile peace they'd built. July 23rd, 1945, he began. If only words didn't break so easily. He described the morning inspection, the heat, the mistranslation, the terror, and the moment when Tomoko rewrote the command that saved them all. He wrote about her steady eyes, the trembling interpreter, the nurse who refused to let compassion lose to fear. And then he added a single line, that no historian could ever forget. The enemy took my hand, not in surrender, but in trust. Outside, the jungle hummed with the same indifferent rhythm of war. Fighter planes still roared overhead. Somewhere beyond the fences, battles were being fought that neither side inside the camp could see. But in that small corner of Luzon, the war had already shifted. Humanity had quietly reclaimed a few square feet of ground. Years later, that very diary would be found in a storage trunk at Clark Field, wrapped in an old ration cloth. Historians catalogued it under the heading, Unverified Palo Account, July 1945, but every line matched official inspection logs. The handwriting, the tone, even the mention of the nurse's stethoscope, all checked out. Tomoko's name appeared only once, circled lightly in pencil. Next to it, Collins had written, "She translated Mercy." Some reports say Collins never left the Pacific after the war. Others say he returned home but never spoke about the camps again. His diary became his confession, and his proof that compassion could survive bureaucracy. One American archivist described it best decades later. It reads less like a soldier's log and more like a man trying to write his way back to innocence. As the last entry ended, the ink smeared under his final sentence, "Tomorrow, I will tell them we did it right." But that tomorrow never came, because the war ended first, and as surrender swept across the Pacific, the diary closed on its own echo, sealing a moment of quiet humanity that would outlast every headline. The war outside had stopped, but the memories inside the wire were only just beginning to breathe again. When the radio finally crackled with the words, "Japan has surrendered," the camp didn't erupt in cheers. It just stopped. For a few long seconds, even the wind seemed unsure of what to do. The guards stood frozen mid-step, the women halfway through washing clothes in tin buckets, soap bubbles sliding down their wrists. Silence fell heavier than gunfire ever had. Tomoko was in the medical hut when she heard it. Lieutenant Dalton translated the broadcast, her voice soft but trembling. "The war is over." Tomoko stared at her hands, pale from months without sun. "Over," she whispered, as if the word itself might vanish if spoken too loud. Outside, Major Collins walked the perimeter, watching soldiers lower flags, their movements uncertain. Victory didn't look like triumph. It looked like confusion. He paused by the barbed wire fence where, only weeks earlier, fear had been the only language spoken. Now, it was disbelief. Freedom had arrived, but it didn't feel like it. For the Japanese women, release meant facing another unknown world, a homeland bombed, burned, and broken. Repatriation records show that many Pacific POWs waited between 7 and 18 months before being returned home. During that time, they lived in limbo, neither prisoner nor free. The barracks grew quieter each night. Some women prayed for news of their families, others just stared into the dark, unable to imagine what home even looked like anymore. Tomoko, however, kept working in the infirmary beside Dalton. They no longer needed a liaison, but they still needed healing. One evening, Collins found her folding bandages by lamplight. "You could leave soon," he said. "Go home." She shook her head gently. "First, I'll help you pack your medicine." He smiled faintly. "Still giving orders, huh?" She returned the smile, her tone soft but steady. Only the kind that save people. For the first time, they both laughed. It wasn't the laughter of victory, it was the sound of exhaustion finding grace. As the weeks passed, the women began writing letters. Some to families, some to ghosts, and one that Tomoko would send years later to a home she'd never seen. The letter would travel across oceans, reaching a man who didn't survive long enough to answer it, but whose words she'd already rewritten in her heart. And that letter would finally close the circle. Tokyo, 1972. A pale envelope arrived at a small suburban home on the outskirts of the city. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded, but the name on the front was unmistakable. To the family of Major Thomas Collins. The letter had traveled across the Pacific, 27 years late, and exactly where it needed to land. Inside, the words were written in slow, deliberate English. My name is Tomoko. I was once a prisoner under your father's command in Luzon. I write not for forgiveness, but for gratitude. She went on to describe the humid hut, the trembling fear, the mistranslated order that had nearly shattered them. She told them how an American nurse had shown humanity without words, how an officer had bowed to his enemies, and how those same 4 words, "Take my hand now," had been rewritten into something that saved lives. Then came the line that silenced everyone who ever read it. Your father taught us that even in war, mercy can be translated. The letter was short, barely 2 pages, but every sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. Historical archives confirm that only 12 letters of reconciliation between former POWs and Allied officers are known to exist. This one, historians say, became the most quoted in Pacific War studies, not because it was grand, but because it was painfully simple. Collins's son, now in his 40s, read it at his kitchen table. He had grown up hearing almost nothing about his father's service, only whispers of something that went wrong in Luzon. Reading Tomoko's letter, he finally understood. The story wasn't one of shame. It was one of repair. He placed the letter inside his father's old diary, where the ink had long since faded. On the final page, he added his own line in pencil. He took their fear and returned it as mercy. That diary and the letter now rest side by side in a museum display. 2 artifacts bound by misunderstanding and redeemed by language. Sometimes history remembers battles, other times it remembers gestures. And on one humid morning in 1945, a single hand extended in confusion became the proof that humanity can survive even inside a cage of wire. Because sometimes, the smallest command, rewritten with care, can rewrite an entire war.